Russia says tonight there is a ceasefire over East Aleppo, but for how long and how many of its citizens will get out alive? Good evening. Russia appears to have imposed a ceasefire over East Aleppo, where tens of thousands of people are cut off from the outside world. Extracting them will be an enormous challenge, and then the unanswered question as to where they will go. As we go to air tonight, the facts on the ground are hard to discern, but we are hearing that there has indeed been a cessation in the bombing.
Also tonight, Britain's chief diplomat puts his foot in it again and is slapped down again by number 10, and not for his jogging dress code. Boris has been discovered venting about Saudi Arabia just as his boss was schmoozing the Saudi king for even more business. What will Brexit and Trump do about climate change? Here, green groups have all joined forces today because they're worried that Brexit will tear up the rule book on environmental protection, while in the US, Trump appoints a well-known climate change skeptic to run the agency that looks after, well, climate change. And what is it about London supermarket security guards and African presidencies? First, a man from Argos ends up as president of the Gambia. Now we hear from a man from Waitrose with his sights set on Ghana.
Plus, we know him as Pete. He knows himself as Peter Doherty, the voice of a generation. He performed at the Bataclan barely a year after the Paris attacks. When Krishnan met him, he rapidly learned not to call him names.
Don't call me a rock star, man.
Well, what, a musician?
That's like me calling you a daytime TV host.
OK.
Maybe rock and roll.
What do you like being called?
Peter.
So Russia has claimed tonight that the Syrian army has suspended active combat operations in eastern Aleppo, whilst a large-scale evacuation of civilians takes place. Sergei Lavrov has said some 8,000 people would be taken out of the rebel-held area where they've been trapped by intense fighting. As Syrian forces advanced further into insurgent territory, the leader of Aleppo's council appealed for civilians to be protected, saying 150,000 people are effectively condemned to death. Diana Magne reports.
There have been very few beautiful moments in Aleppo. This is one of them. My soul, you are everything to me, says this mother to the sons she last saw 5 years ago. The grandson she's meeting for the first time, reunited as eastern Aleppo crumbles to the government's advance. But others aren't so lucky. Here, a family with young children are allowed through into government-controlled western Aleppo. But this young man is frog-marched away. This is what the rebels fear, what fate lies in store for the young men of eastern Aleppo, those who fought the regime and those who didn't. After weeks of ferocious battle, late this afternoon, some kind of breakthrough, it seems, announced by Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
I can inform you that the Syrian army suspended active military operations in eastern Aleppo today because the largest operation so far to remove civilians is being conducted. It's a column of about 8,000 people. It's a colossal operation and its route is 3 miles long.
If this pause in the fighting holds, and it's unclear how long it will, it could not come soon enough. According to the head of Aleppo's local council in the east, as many as 3,500 people have been wounded in the last few weeks of fighting, and 800 killed, with estimates of between 150 and 200,000 civilians still left in the rebels' diminished enclave. A few hours ago, the man in charge of burying Aleppo's dead made this desperate plea.
This may be my last SOS call. Aleppo is dying. There are massacres everywhere. They're killing everyone. I urge you to use all of your power to save whoever is left.
Last night, the Syrian Red Crescent did manage to gain access to the old city, evacuating 148 people with mental health needs and physical disabilities from a centre where they'd been trapped as the fighting raged around them. The White Helmet Civil Defence Force today asked for safe passage out, saying otherwise they'll face torture and execution at the hands of the regime. Their fate and those of the rebels to be decided, Russia says, this weekend at a meeting in Geneva. If Aleppo falls, Assad would control Syria's main cities and much of the western part of the country, where most people live. The area around Idlib still belongs to the rebels, though it's coming under constant regime bombardment. And the rebels still hold pockets around Damascus, Homs and Daraa, where the revolution started. But Syria's map is a messy affair. In the less densely populated east, Islamic State control huge swathes of territory. And in the north, you have the Kurdish areas, a major concern for Turkey, along its southern border. This ancient city is too late to save. The terrified civilians in its ruins are not. But after 6 years where diplomacy has counted for very little, Washington's response today was muted. We'll wait and see, the White House said.
Well, now, before the news of a ceasefire, I spoke to Amin Awad. He's the head of UNICEF's Middle East and North Africa Bureau and the UN's Syria-Iraq Refugee Coordinator. I started by asking him if the UN knows how many civilians there really are still in eastern Aleppo.
Eastern Aleppo today is in a very difficult situation. People have moved several times from one neighborhood to another. Some are trapped and besieged. Some are cowering under buildings and basements. Our estimate, it is over 100,000 persons, roughly, I can speak.
I think many people in the 21st century think that they had the United Nations established to prevent this sort of disaster, that in some way, when the whole thing came to a point at which we were still looking at the end game, that at this point the United Nations would somehow prevail. It hasn't.
The United Nations will prevail when there is a political agreement and a political settlement, which is beyond it is reach. If there is a Security Council consensus on having a pause or an end to, even temporarily, to the conflict in Aleppo or another part of Syria, we will prevail. We're in standby. We have our equipment, our resources, our assistance, our medical supplies to move in any area that the parties will agree that the UN move in and help the civilians.
You will know, Mr. Awad, that there's been criticism of the UN for being too close to Bashar al-Assad. But should that closeness perhaps be used right now to try to urge him to agree to have a corridor?
Our staff, they hold very high principles when it comes to neutrality, impartiality, and our aim is to really help the civilians. These perceptions could prevail, but at the end of the day, that should happen. Yes, there are channels with the government of Syria, there are channels with the opposition, whatever groups they are, but there is no agreement to really allow us to enter. Even if there is a perception that the UN is close to the government, that did not happen yet. Therefore, this perception is not there, perhaps.
But one of the problems is that there is actually a member of the Security Council engaged in this conflict, and yet even that doesn't seem to enable anybody to talk to anybody that is able to deliver anything.
This is an independent branch of the UN, it's a security branch. We know the Security Council, and it is and the issues that we deal with when we have to reach consensus in the Security Council. This is not the first time, not the first war, and it will continue like that. There's a call for reform in the UN. I hope it happens so that we do not find such obstacles in the future. Wars will continue. Today's world state of affairs is not really promising. We were able to close wars faster, quicker, and bring conflicts to an end. If you look back at the 90s, 80s, but of late, we are really not seeing the same happening.
We have a contact inside eastern Aleppo. She is a camera woman. She's a Syrian. She's married to a doctor who's toiling away, trying to help very badly injured people. We know of a group of at least 30 medical staff. What hope can we offer them tonight?
The only hope that I can offer to them and the rest of the people who are there, beyond those 30, there are over 100,000 people there. There are children who are maimed, who are sick, who are about to die or killed. They cannot even be buried. I call on the parties and I call on the powers in the world that may be to really allow us to have access to this population you have just described.
Amin Awad, who represents UNICEF.
Now, Russia and the Syrian regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The battle for Aleppo also high on the agenda for Alex Younger, the chief of MI6, in a rare public speech inside the agency's London HQ. Mr. Younger said that the UK was facing an unprecedented terror threat and blamed Russian action in Syria for increasing the risk of radical extremism. Our foreign affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman went to see him.
On a day with a grim Cold War feel about it, the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, embarked on a strange display of glasnost, letting journalists in to hear their chief, known as C, speak in what is one of London's worst-kept secrets, the MI6 headquarters.
I say pleased, though it's not without a degree of trepidation.
Alex Younger attacking the old enemy, the Kremlin, for its bombing campaign in Syria. His speech filmed by MI6.
In defining as a terrorist anyone who opposes a brutal regime, they alienate precisely that group that has to be on side if the extremists are to be defeated. Meanwhile, in Aleppo, Russia and the Syria regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The human tragedy is heartbreaking. We cannot be safe from the threats that emanate from that land unless the civil war is brought to an end.
The MI6 chief said that British intelligence had disrupted 12 terrorist plots in the UK since June 2013. He said that so-called Islamic State was plotting against Britain from Syria even as he spoke. We can't just pull up the drawbridge, he said. We have to play in the opposing team's half. The CIA claims Russia was behind leaks intended to undermine Hillary Clinton's run for the presidency.
More at this hour about an alleged Russian hack attack.
The Russian government is again denying any involvement in the hacking of the Democratic National Committee.
Without naming Moscow, the MI6 chief said the threat of so-called hybrid warfare extends to Europe.
The connectivity that is at the heart of globalization can be exploited by states with hostile intent to further their aims deniably. They do this through means as varied as cyber attacks, propaganda, or subversion of democratic process. The risks at stake are profound and represent a fundamental threat to our sovereignty. They should be a concern to all of those who share democratic values.
British spies have been trading off the James Bond myth for years, but in terms of reputation it's a double-edged sword. MI6 officers don't have any license to kill, and Bond would be out of a job here.
I'm conflicted about James Bond. He's created a powerful brand for MI6. As C, the real-life version of M, there are few people who will not come to lunch if I invite them. The real-life Q would want me to say that we too enjoy, and indeed need, a deep grasp of gadgetry. But that is pretty much where the similarity ends. And were Mr. Bond to apply to join MI6 now, he would have to change his ways.
Instead, Younger last year ordered his building to fly the LGBT flag in support of gay pride. And his ambition is apparently fewer white ex-public schoolboys like himself.
People have felt that there's a certain single quality that defines an MI6 officer, be it an Oxbridge education or a proficiency in hand-to-hand combat. This is, of course, patently untrue. I'm mesmerised by the possibilities presented by this country's diversity and talent.
This was an attempt to justify MI6's role and its rising budget to the British public. It was also an attempt to encourage a wider range of people to apply to work here. But it was also a bizarre occasion. The speech was actually filmed yesterday with just cameras in the room. Then journalists were invited in this morning to hear the same speech, then given footage of yesterday's speech afterwards. Mr. Younger or his advisors clearly wished to stage manage his brief emergence from the shadows. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Vauxhall.
Is Saudi Arabia playing proxy wars by taking sides in religious conflicts in the Middle East? That's what the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said at a conference just a week ago in Italy. Theresa May clearly doesn't agree. Today, Downing Street sharply and publicly overruled Mr. Johnson, saying his remarks did not reflect the government's views about Saudi Arabia. The row has blown up just a day after Theresa May met the Saudi king at a conference in Bahrain. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
Only yesterday, Theresa May was in Bahrain on a two-day trip devoted to building up relations with the Saudis and their allies in the region. The message throughout the trip: we know you are at war with Iran and its friends on many fronts. We are on your side.
We must also work together to push back against Iran's aggressive regional actions, whether in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, or in the Gulf itself. So I want to assure you that I am clear-eyed about the threat that Iran poses to the Gulf and the wider Middle East.
They were just on their way back from Heathrow when the number 10 team heard that Boris Johnson had been suggesting there was an equivalence between the two sides at war all over the Middle East. The Guardian produced a video of the Foreign Secretary speaking at a conference in Rome a few days ago.
You've got international, you've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars. And it's a tragedy to watch it.
Boris Johnson was implying that the Saudis are flexing their muscles in their relentless attacks on Iranian-backed forces in Yemen.
Are we still allies with the Saudis?
A number 10 spokesperson said the Foreign Secretary, out jogging this morning, was speaking for himself, not the government.
The government has a voice. Number 10 and the Prime Minister's position is preeminent. But the importance is the closeness of the relationship with the Foreign Secretary. And as the Prime Minister demonstrated with her time in Bahrain and her contacts with Saudi Arabia, and the Foreign Secretary will demonstrate with his visit to Saudi Arabia this week, the bilateral relationship between the two will be emphasised through those visits, not through any remarks at a conference.
It's very difficult, isn't it, to have a Foreign Secretary who keeps saying things and then gets slapped down by the Prime Minister. How could any foreign country know what the British position is on anything? And how can anybody negotiate with Boris Johnson?
Later on, Mr Johnson met the Prime Minister face-to-face for a catch-up on her trip.
Is it wise to upset the Saudis, Foreign Secretary?
And ahead of the trip he'll be making to Saudi Arabia next week. One source said it was not an angry meeting. Some think Mr Johnson's words are not enough to damage relations with Saudi Arabia.
But there are historical examples of thin-skinned reactions. That is true. But I actually think that the relationship is strong. The Prime Minister was just there a day or two ago, very importantly, it's sort of ascertaining the partnership. And I think it's on that sort of direct contact rather than the interpretation of a remark here or a remark there that its strength depends, really.
3, 2, 1.
Theresa May was switching on the Christmas lights in Downing Street this evening. She's a Prime Minister who likes messages to be under strict control. And this slapdown looks as much as anything about her asserting her authority.
Prime Minister, will Boris Johnson still be Foreign Secretary when Santa comes, Prime Minister?
For a minister who's made a good living for years, speaking his own mind in grabby language.
Well, Gary joins us live from Westminster now. Gary, is Mr Johnson in danger after all?
I think it's important to remember why he's in that job at all. Theresa May felt when she was forming her cabinet that she ought to have one of the two big figures in the Vote Leave campaign in her team. She was on the losing side. And she felt she couldn't trust Michael Gove, so in the end she went for Boris Johnson and put him there. And I think she'll probably feel that she still needs that sort of ballast from the other side for the turbulent months that lie ahead. Certainly for the moment, I don't think he's committed a crime that overrules that sort of judgment. The other thing is, if you've appointed someone like Boris Johnson to a really big job, and you get rid of them, you take a lot of collateral yourself. I think Theresa May's own judgment would come into question a bit. It would look a little bit flaky. And the other thing is, getting rid of Boris Johnson is not like getting rid of the permanent Undersecretary for paperclips. This is one of the most famous politicians in the world. I'm told, interestingly, that in that famous meeting when Nigel Farage and his entourage go in and see Donald Trump in his glitzy apartment in New York, Donald Trump at one point actually asked them, is that blonde guy still popular? This is a man with extraordinary international reach. It would not go unnoticed if she were to get rid of him. She's not at that point yet. She is frustrated with him, but she's hoping with this warning shot, this yellow card, he'll buckle down and get on message.
Gary Gibbon. Matt.
Thanks, Tom. The blonde guy. Now, they say that they're not trying to overturn the referendum result, merely interpret it. Judges at the Supreme Court have now finished hearing a landmark legal challenge questioning whether the government has the power to trigger the Brexit process without consulting Parliament. The court said it would decide the ruling as quickly as possible after lawyers described Brexit as the most divisive political event for several decades. Well, before coming on air, I spoke to Gina Miller, the lead claimant in the case against the government, and I started by asking her, given that Parliament voted on a timetable yesterday, is she still happy the case is going her way?
We have to understand that my case is about a fundamental constitutional issue, which is only an act of parliament, primary legislation, can establish or take away people's rights. So a motion with a timetable is really not good enough.
There was an awful lot of anger and emotion stirred up by the High Court ruling, and also in the last few days as the case was being heard by the Supreme Court. What do you say to those 52%, or some of those 52% of the British public, who basically accuse you and the unelected judges of trying to thwart the will of the people?
Well, this is exactly what they voted for. British law in a British court decided by British judges to preserve British parliamentary sovereignty. This is exactly what we should be voting for.
But they're afraid that Parliament is being used, that the courts are being used to either kick Brexit into the long grass or, at the end of the day, possibly even subvert it.
No, because this case is about the mechanism of how we leave. It's not about leaving. It's about the process and the mechanism. In every walk of life, there's a process. If you want to drive a car, you have to apply for a license, get insurance, MOTs. There was no process in place when it came to Article 50, and that's what this case is asserting.
But there are some Remainers who hope that the process will be so complicated and long-winded that at the end of the day, it might lead to an overturning of the original result, either with another referendum or indeed an election that will result in something
I have to say,
different.
I'm not in the camp of a second referendum. I don't believe we have to move forwards, and that has to be about a vote in Parliament. And those people who say that it will thwart the will because of Parliament voting on this, actually look at the motion, your original question yesterday. It was, a huge in favour of voting for the government. So I do not believe that there is a will in the Parliament to overturn Brexit.
Now, after the High Court ruling, you got some extraordinary abuse in social media. I mean, really repulsive stuff. People calling for you to be killed, to be deported, someone, I think, wishing that you got cancer. I mean, really nasty, nasty stuff. What's your response to those people?
Well, first of all, I can say that it's not just on social media. It's much closer than that. It's letters, emails, calls.
Is that still going on?
Still going on.
Every day?
Yes, every day. And there was an announcement this week on the police action. There are more being investigated by the police. But what I think is, I have to put it to one side, because people are angry. And I don't actually blame them for being angry, because we got here because of people's anger, because people are angry that they're not being considered, they're being left behind, that phrase the politicians use. So I'm not angry with them. What I am angry with, I'm angry with the politicians and certain media who are enabling people or think to them it's okay to behave like this. It isn't.
Do you think the government has done enough to silence that kind of abuse?
Absolutely not. I mean,
have you asked them to do something? Have you written to the Prime Minister and said, say something about this?
No. We have taken action legally and through other associations and IPSO, etc., where we've asked, I have complained, but I would have thought that the Prime Minister herself would have thought about this. David Davis did stand up in Parliament on the Monday, but I have to say it's shameful that it took a question from Chuka Munif to allow him to do that. But more politicians of all colours should be standing up and saying this is wrong.
Gina Miller, thanks very much.
Welcome.
From clean air to the use of pesticides, much of the country's environmental protection rules are bound up with our membership of the EU. So what happens next? Today, leading environmental campaign groups came together in a new coalition called Greener UK, declaring Brexit could provide an opportunity to make Britain a world leader on green policy and to keep those protections in place. Our science editor, Tom Clark, has been finding out more.
The environment has been central to the European project since the 1970s.
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Getting sewage off our beaches, stopping cars pumping out lead fumes, taking the sting out of acid rain, capping toxic pollution and greenhouse gases from industry and preserving vulnerable habitats and birds. For 40 years, UK and European rules have worked in tandem to protect the planet. Like here at the newly created Woodbury Wetlands in North London, a once sterile reservoir closed to the public for 200 years, now open, restored as a refuge for wildlife among Hackney high-rises. It's part of an EU special protection area across the suburban wilderness of the Lee Valley. It's European rules and regulations that help to create and preserve sites like this one across the UK. And today, campaigners are uniting to call on government to ensure that it's the environment that doesn't get left behind in their great post-Brexit shake-up. Today sees the formation of Greener UK, a coalition of 13 of Britain's biggest wildlife, environment and conservation groups.
Whatever happens, leaving the EU will be the biggest change to our environment and wildlife laws that we've seen. And therefore, there is a risk that that could not really be noticed and that we gradually see them weaken those laws. But there's also an opportunity, because this is something that virtually everyone in the country cares about, for the government to take this opportunity to set out some really visionary, positive ways forward for the natural world.
There's not just anxiety about untangling our environment laws. Europe can and does act as eco-police, today threatening the UK and 6 other states with legal action for not fining Volkswagen over the diesel emissions scandal.
And the problem that you see with Dieselgate is that the UK regulator was not sufficiently independent or tough to actually do the job of protecting consumers and protecting citizens from air pollution in the UK.
The government said today it would respond in the strongest terms to any threatened legal action from Brussels. And politicians who backed Brexit argue the emissions scandal grew out of flawed EU emission standards, supporting their argument that leaving the EU presents an opportunity to have green laws tailored for Britain.
The great thing about leaving the European Union is this is now decided by our own democracy as to whether we have higher standards or lower standards, or we have standards that are simply more appropriate to the United Kingdom, because we may have different issues facing this nation from those facing landlocked Central European states.
Environmentalists would agree there are huge opportunities to better protect nature beyond the EU. But their worry is that the economic and social demands of Theresa May's red, white and blue Brexit will overshadow the green.
Tom Clark reporting. Well, in the United States, Donald Trump has named a leading climate change denier to run the Environmental Protection Agency, alarming campaigners who say Scott Pruitt is a friend of the fossil fuel industry and will roll back years of progress on policies to tackle global warming. Here's our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris.
At Trump Tower this week, one of America's best-known environmental advocates, Al Gore, arrived for a meeting, a positive sign to many that the president-elect might just soften his position on climate change. Even Al Gore himself sounded positive.
The bulk of the time was with President-elect Donald Trump. I found it an extremely interesting conversation and to be continued.
But actually, not really, because Donald Trump just rolled a hand grenade into the global battle against climate change by nominating enemy number one of the Environmental Protection Agency, Oklahoma's Attorney General Scott Pruitt, to take over the agency. Donald Trump, it seems, is keeping his word.
The EPA is so restrictive that they are putting our energy companies out of business. And all you have to do is go to a great place like West Virginia, and you see what they're doing in the energy business. It's a disgrace.
The nomination of Pruitt throws red meat to Trump voters, coal miners in states like West Virginia, looking for salvation for their industry. To meet its commitments agreed in Paris to reduce greenhouse gases, President Obama devised a clean power plan in the US to transform the energy sector away from coal toward cleaner energy sources. But conservative states have fought the plan, led by Oklahoma's Scott Pruitt.
And since 2010, we've seen over 400 coal generation facilities shut down in this country. So this plan, this clean power plan that the president is advancing through his EPA, is all about an anti-fossil fuel strategy to shut down coal generation and fossil fuel generation in the generation of electricity. And you should be very concerned about that.
But far more concerning for environmental groups today is that Donald Trump has appointed someone to lead the EPA who denies that human activity has caused climate change.
It's an extremely disappointing pick. The leader of the EPA should believe in climate change, should want to fight on behalf of Americans for clean energy and for clean water, and Scott Pruitt is the exact opposite of those things.
The facade came down off this old building here on 6th Street.
What's clear is that Scott Pruitt fights for oil and gas, big business in his home state, where the fracking industry is linked to an extraordinary convulsion of earthquakes. There are 2 or more daily now in Oklahoma, where 8 years ago there were just 2 each year. Now, Scott Pruitt, the state's Attorney General, is set to have his own seismic effect in Washington and beyond. Now, you might observe a pattern emerging here in the Trump cabinet. The president-elect has appointed someone who doesn't really believe in public education to be the education secretary. It's unclear that Ben Carson has any experience with housing, but he's now the housing secretary. And with Pruitt, well, environmentalists are saying it's like putting an arsonist in charge of fighting fires. But remember, this was a change election, and that is exactly what the president-elect is delivering. There are unconventional appointments, certainly. The former CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment, Linda McMahon, who was also a major donor to the Trump Foundation in years past, as well as giving $6 million to his presidential campaign, she's going to head the Small Business Administration Department. Many of the others he's ushering in are the mega-rich captains of industry. He says they'll help him to put America's house in order as he turns their expertise at making money to the nation's advantage. Now, of course, there are potential, some might say gaping prospective pitfalls. Where do you draw the line between business and government? Does the new head of the EPA serve industry or the environment? Well, the much-discussed Secretary of State who'll guide foreign affairs for the US, potentially the most important cabinet pick, likely to be announced next week.
Kylie in Washington, thank you very much. Now, from retirement to health problems or becoming a new mother, all trigger points in life which can leave someone not just isolated, but alone. In fact, 9 million people in the UK are lonely. That's according to research by the Co-op and the British Red Cross. Almost epidemic proportions. Tonight, in the third of our films on loneliness, Victoria MacDonald has been talking to Tony Fisher. He lost 3 members of his family in the space of just 1 year, as well as suffering from mental health problems.
Loneliness means different things to different people. In my case, what might epitomise it is going home to a lonely house, particularly in the dark, in the winter time. And no matter how excited you are about something or depressed about something, there's nobody there to actually engage with.
This is loneliness for Tony Fisher, the door between him and the rest of the world. The dread of those 4 walls so deep, he will at times just sit outside in his car.
What does it physically feel like to be lonely?
It physically feels like sometimes you get like a knot in the stomach, or you feel just like a coldness coming over or something like that. It's hard to explain really. It's just it just feels not good.
How Tony Fisher came to be lonely is really a story about the frailty of life, the loss of family, a mental health condition, anxiety.
Well, what's made me lonely? Well, I'm an only child, and I suppose even from the early days, I did a lot of things on my own. But what really hit home was the fact that when I got married, I didn't get married until I was gone 30, that my wife died at a young age of 43, but at the same time, within a few weeks, my mother dropped dead, and my father got cancer and dropped dead. And I was left with a complete vacuum, and then my children had to go away and live elsewhere.
Those deaths might have been more than 20 years ago, but the reverberations are still being felt today. And research by the Co-op and the British Red Cross describes 6 common trigger points for loneliness, including bereavement and long-term health conditions like mental illness. That is Tony. When we first meet, it's at an exhibition of his photographs. Some reflecting solitude and loneliness, but not all of them. Because he does not want loneliness to define him.
I don't want to look at the past anymore. I want to create new memories. I want to move forward. So it's a constant battle between the blackness and the light. And I always head into the light. I always say my saving grace is that, well, 3 things really: my art, my poetry and my sense of humour. Those are 3 saving graces, I think. And also I do have a lot of interests, and they're really important to me.
Cheers then. Cheers. Happy Christmas.
Today's research estimates that 9 million people in the UK are always or often lonely. Moments of interaction like this,
Yeah, go on then.
across the mince pies and alcohol-free red wine, offer some temporary respite.
I keep using this analogy of the spaceship trying to take off. I just want to break through to the other side. That sounds like a Doors song, sorry, but I want to think that this isn't it. You know what I mean? The rest of my life, no. I'm very determined that I won't let it defeat me. And that's the message I really want to get across. That whatever loneliness you've got or whatever you've got, it doesn't mean that's it. Things can change.
And that was Tony Fisher talking to Victoria McDonald. And if you are affected by this issue, go to our website for places which might offer help. John.
Now today, the Chief Medical Officer released a report about the baby boomer generation, recommending they should stay active in employment or volunteer until their 70s to stay healthier longer and to avoid loneliness. In light of her research, I spoke to Professor Dame Sally Davies and began by asking her whether it's officially accepted that loneliness is a serious problem in Britain.
Well, loneliness does cause ill health and shortened lives. Over 20% of men in the baby boomer generation do live on their own, so they are at particular risk. But what I was highlighting in today's report is, of course, that if you stay socially engaged through work, whether paid or unpaid, volunteering, charity, then you are less likely to suffer loneliness, your quality of life improves, and you're likely to live longer and better.
One of the problems seems to be that if you want agents of change who are going to sort of bring about more community amongst people in their older years, more community amongst people, you know, single mothers or mothers who are just having their first baby, then you do need possibly somebody from the state to intervene, a community nurse or somebody.
Well, that is one route, but I still remember when I had my children, I met once a week through the National Childbirth Trust. There are many charities and ways of doing this from the community.
Dame Sally, only the other day, an 89-year-old man who complained of dying of boredom got a job in a cafe somewhere in London. Now, I mean, that took a guy to get up off his bottom and do it. But the truth is, how many employers out there are there who are really prepared to take people in their 60s, 70s and 80s?
Well, there are companies who've been looking particularly for older people, but it is clearly going to change because by 2020, 1 in 3 of the working population are going to be in this age group.
So what's your main recommendation to government today?
The purpose of this report was not to give recommendations. It is actually bringing data and issues to the attention of everyone.
But that, in the end, is the acid question, isn't it? In an age of cuts, when both health and social care are under siege, you haven't got anybody in the state who can really intervene to help these people.
We need the community to support each other through actually talking to our neighbours in the winter, reaching out through charities, and helping with local employment. This cannot be down to just the state.
And isn't the greatest difficulty, which is clearly one that you're helping to address, ignorance, that actually society as a whole is not aware of how lonely there are, how many lonely people there are, and indeed what they could do to improve the situation?
Absolutely. So I rather hope that this report will, through the media, like your interview, actually raise awareness of these issues so people can start to think how they can play in to help.
Dame Sally Davies, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
The Scottish MP has been praised for her bravery after revealing to the Commons that she was raped when she was 14 years old. Michelle Thompson moved MPs to tears as she described the attack during a debate on violence towards women.
Afterwards, I walked home alone. I was crying, I was cold and I was shivering, and I now realise, of course, that was the shock response. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell the police. I bottled it all up inside me. I hoped briefly and appallingly that I might be pregnant so that that would force a situation to help me control it. And of course, without support, the capacity and resources I had within me to process it were very limited. I was very ashamed. I was ashamed that I had allowed this to happen to me. And I had a whole range of internal conversations about, I should have known. Why did I go that way? Why did I walk home with him? Why didn't I understand the danger? I deserved it because I was too this, I was too that. I felt that I was spoiled and impure. And I really felt revulsion towards myself.
Michelle Thompson MP in the Commons there today. Now, a powerful magnitude 7.7 earthquake has struck off the Solomon Islands, triggering a series of tsunami warnings across the South Pacific. The quake hit in the early hours of this morning, about 25 miles beneath the ocean. Officials warned there could be hazardous tsunami waves along the islands, as well as coasts in surrounding island nations, including Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea.
Ghana's opposition leader has already claimed a famous and historic victory in today's presidential elections, even though there won't be any official results for at least 2 days. The election, dominated by Ghana's struggling economy, has been close fought. But the success of Gambia's new president, Adama Barrow, who worked as a security guard in North London, has provided something of a role model for Ghanaians here, with political ambitions of their own. And so we decided to ask Joseph Afrani, who is also a security guard here, and who writes a widely read blog on Ghanaian politics, for his views. And here's his report.
I am from Ghana. I work in a supermarket in Camden. I've been working as a security guard for 6 years. Working in security, you watch people closely. You think about people. Last week, a security guard from Lagos became the president of Gambia. Adama Barrow beat Yahya Jammeh, who had been in power for more than 20 years.
Ghana, we now have freedom.
In my lunch breaks, I write about politics. I update my blog with the latest news. Thousands of people in Ghana and the UK read my blog. At the moment, I'm busy writing about the presidential and parliamentary elections in Ghana. The elections results are very tight, but today the opposition is calling President Mahama to concede defeat. Hackers have targeted the website of Ghana's Electoral Commission ahead of the release of the results.
Ghana, land of freedom, everybody talk.
The opposition is led by Nana Akufo-Addo. The opposition say they will create factories in every district and Ghana will be more industrialized. The government is led by President John Mahama of National Democratic Congress, NDC. They've been in power for a long time, their shine has come off, and the opposition is suddenly appealing. Ghana is the world's second largest producer of cocoa, and 6 years ago they discovered offshore oil, but lower prices have caused serious economic decline. The politicians are now battling to revive Ghana's fortune. From here in London, I'll be watching closely.
Adama Barrow and his blog hoping at some stage to become Ghana's next president. John.
I think he's called actually Joseph Afrani, but we'll sort that out. After the break, from prison to rehab with rock and roll in between. Now it's all about the music for the Liberties' Pete Doherty after the Paris attacks. He says, pick up a guitar, not a gun. Prison, drugs and rock and roll with a bit of rehab thrown in. That's been Pete Doherty's life for these last days. The former Libertines frontman insists it's all about the music. He told us He had to get clean to play at the recently reopened Bataclan club in Paris, where 89 people were killed in last year's terrorist attack. When Krishnan met him at London's The Forum, he was given an impromptu rendition of a new song inspired by those attacks. Don't pick up a gun, pick up a guitar.
Come on, boys, choose your weapon. J45 and AK-47. There's hell to pay. The gates of heaven when the whole show. Here comes a tumbling down.
And that's your J45?
This is me new J45, yeah.
Can you tell me about that song?
It's self-explanatory, isn't it, really?
Did you write it out of anger about what happened in Paris, or trying to understand it, or what? Because you were in Paris the night of those attacks, weren't you?
I was, yeah.
What happened?
My girlfriend was coming back from a funeral, actually. And I was supposed to meet her at the airport, but there was blockades, you know? There was army everywhere, it was just lights, and it turns out that the friend whose funeral she was coming back from was part of this group of friends from school, 4 of whom were at a birthday party celebration at the cafe where one of the gunmen went, and they all died as well. So really, it was all more about trying.
School friends of your girlfriend.
Yeah. It sort of seems like everyone in Paris knew someone who was there.
And so, what was playing the Bataclan like for you then? Was it a very emotional thing to do?
When we got the call, will you reopen the Bataclan? It was that feeling of pride, really. Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Continue de la terre. It's a perfect song for the occasion, actually. Allons enfants, come on, children of the country, the day of glory is here. Against us, the tyranny. You know, basically, you've got the huge 89-legged black octopus of whatever. You know, it could represent. Fundamental terrorists could represent, a dangerous drug, but it's coming for you and your kids. Stand up, fight. That's what it's saying.
So how different is this experience to the Libertines?
Libertines is a lifelong trip with very dear friends that, for one reason or another, will never end. I love it, but it's not like, fucking airport, hotel, massive venue, back to the hotel, back to the airport,
You don't like that bit about being a rock star?
Don't call me a rock star, man.
Well, what, a musician?
That's like me calling you a daytime TV host.
Okay.
Maybe rock and roll star.
What do you like being called?
Peter. No, and I've got a problem with rock star, honestly, I have. It feels offensive.
Well, I don't mean it to be offensive at all.
Well, it was, but, I forgive you. When you're young, idealistic, you don't care. You play to no one, you play in your bedroom. Like young kids with football. You play and you just love it, you just love the music, and then bang. As soon as you're in the industry and you think that's the dream, that's where the dream starts to end.
What do you want for your future? Do you want to keep working?
I'd like to get my camper van mended, and there's a French rapper, yeah, who came on stage with us the other day. I forget the French line, but someone translated it for me, and it was, I don't want to end up 50 and lost, is one of his lines,
How old are you?
26 or 37, 37, yeah.
You've got a while yet then.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was a good line, interesting,
But do you think you'll keep performing?
I never thought I'd make it this far, man.
Well, did you actually?
I saw a future because I was actually always just this mellow, always kind of a quiet one in our group of lads, and they were all surprised when I suddenly got presented as this like rock and roll wild man because, there was plenty of candidates for that. It was never like Pete, nice Pete. So it was all exaggerated, blown up, absolute rubbish. Like I said, picture to me when I was sneezing, Going to prison for nothing, going to prison for being in the papers, basically. Getting arrested for being in the papers all the time, It's just like, I think I was having too good a time, and too many people were pissed off. They were like, yeah, having a good time, have some of that. You know what I mean? You're not having a good time. We didn't get our dreams, you're not getting yours. 6 months, 14 weeks. Go to rehab.
Are you still having a good time?
It's not going too badly, is it, this interview?
I mean, generally, beyond this interview.
Recently, yeah, it's been all right.
I heard a recording of you in a concert in Nantes, in which you thanked the crowd.
Not on normal courtyard exercise. That's the name of the live recording.
Yeah. You thanked the crowd for bringing you method.
No, I didn't thank him. I said, merci, mais je suis propre 4 semaines maintenant. So I said, thank you, but no thanks. I've been clean for 4 weeks now. That's what I said.
When was that?
When was that? That was the other day. That's the first time in my whole career when I haven't actually needed the bloody stuff, and someone throws it on. Where were they for the last 15 years?
On stage?
Yeah.
And you stayed clean now?
Yeah, I had to do the Bataclan clean, and then I thought, it, I'll do London clean and see what happens then, because I've had some amazing nights here, but I can't even remember any of them.
How have you done it? Have you been on a programme, or have you just done it yourself?
Thing, all these programmes, all these years, and then finally something's just gone, something's just clicked, and you should see my feet, they're lovely now.
You just stopped yourself?
Well, you see, Buenos Aires, like, apparently they produce it there, but it all goes to America. You can't get it on the street there. So we got to the point where I was, let's just do this. So I just lay on my back on the floor of the hotel room. After 4 or 5 mornings, that was it. So I don't know what it is. Something's just clicked, and I can't do it now. I need to go and see my mum and dad clean, and I need to do some music clean, and enough's enough, you know.
Pete Doherty confessing all to Krish. And tributes have been paid to Greg Lake, former frontman of the rock bands King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who's died at the age of 69.
There'll be snow at Christmas. They said there'll be peace on earth.
The British-born musician, who was one of the founders of the progressive rock, was also well known for his solo hit, I Believe in Father Christmas. His manager said that he passed away yesterday after a long and stubborn battle with cancer.
Tonight's main news, Russia claims Syrian army has stopped active military operations in East Aleppo to allow some 8,000 civilians trapped by the fighting out. The UN Syrian refugee coordinator told this programme an end to hostilities was critical.
The only hope that I can offer to them and the rest of the people who are there beyond those 30, there are over 100,000 people there. There are children who are maimed, who are sick, who are about to die or killed. They cannot even be buried. I call on the parties and I call on the powers in the world that may be to really allow us to have access to this population.
That's all we have time for. Thanks for watching.
That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.